Yeah, Dita asked me to talk today about decolonising ourselves. There's a fair bit of background before we get to that particular activity. It's a bit of it's a build-up, yeah. It's a plot line of a movie or something. That's important for us to know a lot of stuff to feel a lot of stuff really before we can get to that part of decolonising, which obviously won't happen in tonight's session, but we can learn more about it. So I'll start in the style of my place in the world by acknowledging country. This is something that we do around here in so-called Australia. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the unceded land upon which I live, play and work and create, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, as well as other Indigenous peoples and everyone else here who seeks to decolonise. Also honour Bunjil as the great ancestor creator of the Kulin Nations and the country that I'm on and that I'm part of as I sit here today in my home. And acknowledge all the countries and all the ancestors of all the people that have lived on those countries that you are coming to this meeting from today as well. So this relatively short gathering still has some ground rules and grounding rules. When I say rules, they're kind of just advice that I would suggest. I'm not really into rules as such. Let's call it grounding advice instead of ground rules. So the gathering seeks to welcome and challenge. There are no right or wrong ideas, expressions or feelings. Ask questions, make comments, express confusions anytime. Be respectful, listen deeply, respond humbly with your truth. Very interested in your truth in this forum. Critique answers, concepts, etc., but don't criticize people. Not in this sort of short session, unless you know them well. Contribute, share, and offer your experience and wisdom while ensuring that you make space for others to also do so. Apparently, we have auto translation as well now. So if anyone can't understand the gibberish I'm speaking, you can swap to another language and hopefully that'll help. Feel free to interrupt at any time and rupture what I'm saying. There will be points of, well, invite discussion, but obviously you're very welcome to interrupt as well. Transcription, auto transcription, got it. Well, that's not quite as useful as translating my speech, but hey, let's go with that too. So about me, a little bit about me. I'm an Anglo-Asian Aboriginal Australian, identified as such since birth, and through my mother's line. My grandmother was a member of what we call the stolen generations around here in Australia, where colonial powers like to steal children from Indigenous people and in order to destroy their culture and generally oppress and exploit. I'm a descendant of the Wakai people. Little map coming up next about that. I was born in Northern Australia, lived in and grew up in Northern Australia, now live in very much the southern most parts of Australia for quite a while now, 14, 15 years. So this is a bit of a zoomed in map of Australia, if anyone's familiar with what it looks like. And that's where my people are from, up in the north, kind of Gulf of Carpentaria, we call it, country up there. This is the bigger map of Australia, a little bit more familiar perhaps. And just a lot of tribal groups that are coloured in on this map to show the different, mostly bioregions, but also tribal boundaries where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people lived, Indigenous people of Australia before colonisation. So hundreds of groups distinct interrelated groups that existed before European invasion a few centuries ago now. So the first activity for you, so you don't have to listen to me in long stretches in this session, thankfully. I'm going to break out the group into small little groups of maybe 3 or 4 people. And what I would invite you to do is say something about yourself, introduce yourself essentially to the other people in your group. Maybe someone start who has something that resonates with what I briefly described about myself, and then follow in a kind of resonance with the other, with something that you can link with the person before you, basically. We're talking about 1 or 2 minute introduction each, nothing long. And I invite you to say something about race, place, and time. Race, place, and time as part of your introduction. Welcome back, everybody, to the main room. I should mention that in some of these activities, I might you might see me kind of joining your small groups, just sort of traveling through to listen in and perhaps say a word or two. I didn't do that with this exercise, but I may well do that in some upcoming small group breakout room activities. So anybody want to share how they felt about that particular activity, or how things went in your small group in general? Yes, Jane.
Hello, I'm Jane in the Highlands of Scotland. I'd like to share that that was a delightful encounter with one other person called Chris from Tasmania, and I didn't check with Chris whether it was okay to share anything, so I'm sorry, Chris, if it's not. But what we did identify is that we were both what's called third culture kids. So I grew up with a white working class English culture in my home, and outside of the walls of my home was the Buddhist and Christian traditions of the land of Burma. And third culture kids amalgamate the cultures that are inside and outside and make their own culture, and that's really contributed to the way I interact with the world and this whole question of race and colonization. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Third culture, interesting. Fusion cultures. Perhaps one more person, if you feel called to say anything before I share screen again.
Yes, indeed.
Please be.
Yeah, I think we really enjoyed that in our group. We had 2 people of mixed race, and for me personally, I find the connection with place to be very difficult, and I'm trying to establish it now in the latter years of my life.
Thank you, Mark. It can be very hard in a disconnected, disembodied culture to connect with place. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to move on to the cultural iceberg now. So, cultural iceberg is just a way of getting a sense of the depth of what culture is for humans. Animals also have culture as well, but we'll mostly focus on the human animal today. So there's lots of above surface stuff, easy to see stuff, and then there's underneath stuff, of course, which is very much gives us those capacities to connect with place, or to understand a race, or to sense time, among many other things. And yeah, just very diverse. Cultures are very diverse, and some of them are colonial cultures, some of them are indigenous cultures, historical cultures, many, many types. And we'll talk about some aspects of those today. Here's an example of culture. How close do you stand to other people? You know, when you're having a conversation, maybe, you know, room or something, at a gathering of some sort. This was a study of that. You know, what's the distance? Sort of a personal boundary, personal space distance thing. Measured in feet, some American researchers. And they found a kind of universal, which is people stand closer to those that they feel socially connected to. And closer social relationships means closer physical distance in standing conversations, for example. And then personal acquaintance who are more socially distant, and strangers who are the most socially distant. So that's a kind of a universal. But the actual distance varied a lot between these countries, you know, based on the cultures in those countries where people lived, among other things. And it's interesting to think about whether this might have changed with COVID and sense of safety or danger from sharing air with other people. Who knows? So there's that example. Norwegians get really close. Yes, thank you, Teresa. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of variation in the numbers. Yes, good question about changes in physical distance based on gender and class, urban setting, context, rural cultures, formality as well of a situation that people might be in that would have an impact. A lot of different things could make an impact on these sorts of things. Just an example, interesting enough. This is a bit of a deeper example. So some linguists decided to do this thing called cross-cultural codability of senses, where they studied people in all these different places around the world, quite a spread of places. And what they tried to figure out is how many words, or what's the density of words, something like that, that people have to describe the senses that we use to experience the world. And this is what they found. They found that for sense of smell, taste, touch, hearing, and sight split up into shape perception and color perception, there was a lot of range in how densely coded these senses were in the words of these languages, from low coding to high coding. Yeah, so number of words to describe the senses. And you can see not only does the density of those coding for those senses vary a lot, but the order of them, the hierarchy. And you can sort of, I guess, assume that perhaps certain senses are more important in certain languages, depending on how many words there are to explain them, if you wanted to. That's what this is about. So yeah, it's very interesting indeed. And it's important in the sense that, well, because the senses are what we use to experience the world. Yeah, that's how the only way we have, really. There's many more senses than these that we can think of, but certainly those are the ways. And so, yeah, people may be experiencing the world in quite different ways based on their culture and their language and their histories and so forth. So any thoughts on this? The grey box is shape perception. So sight is actually fairly complicated, but part of sight is perceiving shapes and the other part is perceiving colours. Happens in different parts of the eye. Portugal, is that a question? I don't know if we have that on the list. Good question. question. Has anyone got any thoughts about this? Or has anyone got any other senses that they think it would be interesting to add to the list? Yep, good observation about taste. Yep, that's a really interesting one, I think. You can see it's quite an outlier in many cases on the right side of the diagram. Relationality of senses, sensory pluralism. I'm just reading from the chat quite a lot, if anyone didn't pick that up. Sense of space, spatial awareness. Yep, all that stuff. Magnetic sense. Yeah, there's quite a few studies now of humans. Certainly we know birds can, but humans being able to sense magnetism. Yep, lots of senses. Sense of balance, internal senses like hunger and thirst as well. Pain, temperature are all quite separate forms of touch, sense. 6 senses of various kinds, intuition. There's lots of ways to think about it. Instincts of various sorts. Yep. Exactly. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting study to think about culture and language and sensing and how deep that can go for us as humans. Now on to the colonial stuff. Here's a map of every country that Britain has ever invaded. Not countries in white. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Since forever, yes, since the beginning of invasion. Yeah, sort of like, we're talking 15th, 14th, 15th century, yeah. And then we have the next one, which is all the countries that European powers have controlled or invaded or colonized. A little bit more nuanced. Yes, invaded, colonized is what I'm talking about. So, well, not always colonized, but attempted colonization in some cases. Here we have Europe itself. We have a sort of green colonized, controlled by Europe thing, colonized, controlled, maybe some distinction there. Never colonized by Europe, very small numbers in orange, and some sort of partial control, which is, you know, really, the whole global system is controlled by European powers at this point in time, but things developed over the last few centuries. So it's quite a small world when it comes to colonization, is what I'm saying. And monocultures have developed based on very European ideas or very British, but other European powers, ideas of what culture should be like. And that's a very strong influence now on the world, economics, socially, and so forth, politically. But also it's monocultural in many ways. It's not so much even that it's a problem of whether any one culture should have such control over what should be a very diverse global ecosystem, regardless of what that culture is. And of course, yes, many invasions within Europe itself and colonizations. And yes, I'll mention some of the aspects of that in some upcoming slides. This one, in fact. So modernity. I like to call it modernity. It's sort of modern cultures. Yeah, it's a fairly common term, modernity, and often applied to kind of this rise of European cultures from the 15th century onwards. And here are some of the key aspects of that culture, from certainly from a sort of broad brush approach. So private property was a very strong feature created through the violent enclosure of peasants' lands or people who just wanted to live on the land and grow food and sort of exist in peace. That was all stolen from them during the enclosures throughout Europe from the 15th century onwards. Yeah, often in different spurts in different places, different speeds and timelines, but around those times onwards. Of course, the new invasion of the new, often what's called the New World, and decimation of indigenous populations and stealing of all that land happened from that point on as well. Not often mentioned as a key feature of modernity, but very important, was the witch hunts, which destroyed proto-feminism and did a lot of damage to women's power in societies. Dynamic, hypergeometric, dynamic, personalized oral memory. Now, it's going to take a while to explain that. But basically, writing was a huge change in culture. Obviously, writing was invented a long time before the 15th century, but it wasn't very widely used until the invention of the printing press, and it became changed from an elite form of knowledge to a more common form of knowledge, recording knowledge. There's a lot of interesting stuff about oral traditions and the impact that has on human culture. It's not simply a method of knowledge production, it has much more profound impacts. So that was a big change as part of modernity. And of course, the way that economics worked was really a big part of that change as well. Production, distribution, exchange became controlled much more than it was before by a wealthy elite, with the extraction of resources from the majority via industrialization and wage labor, which were both inventions that occurred during different parts of modernity, some earlier than others. Proto-feminism, it just means, looking at the chat now, not photo, proto, maybe that was a typo. It's just like early forms of feminism, not the kind of not the waves of feminism that we've had in the 19th and 20th century, but just the more egalitarian societies, the gender egalitarian societies that used to exist before colonialism and modernization. They're not technically feminism in the sense that they're not part of that modern movement, but they are very much more effective. Through most of history, a lot of gender egalitarianism existed. Yeah. So here's a kind of a chart of what, some nice cartoon of what some people think modernity looks like now. We have, this is important, we have the everything is awesome kind of story that I hear quite a lot, actually. I've been running into a lot of young people recently who say things like, that what we see now in the world is the best it's ever been. That's what they tell me. This is the best it's ever been. And this is epitomized by these sort of thought bubbles here, or speech bubbles. We've never been healthier, happier, wealthier. We have science, democracy, rights, education, modern medicine. We live longer. People in Africa have mobile phones and washing machines. We need to protect our way of life and get the rest of the world on board. Obviously, this is a very Western first world perspective. Not one that I agree with in any way. And then we have the other sort of grey zones of life: austerity, economic instability, unaffordable housing, food, water insecurity, underemployment, unemployment, climate change, big pharma, arms trade, mental health crisis, healthcare that's unaffordable, mass migration, blood minerals, the darker underside of the everything is awesome story. And then we have the sort of, even in the first world, we have, increasingly difficult to buy housing, not many jobs, expensive education, a loneliness and depression epidemic, unsustainable consumption, and so on. Surplus labour force, not enough oil or expensive oil. Some of the challenges of modernity and some of the ways it's framed as a positive story, as a negative story, as a we've never done better, but we can do better in the future. It's just a sort of a linear progression or advancement of society from bad to okay to better to amazing. There's lots of ways to think about it. This is one example. Here's another example. This example is about taking on board aspects of modernity and how they work with colonial processes. So economically, this idea of continuous economic growth, wealth accumulation is really achieved through racialized exploitation of humans and other life on Earth. We have nation states which promise security, protection, property rights, a sort of cohesion through identity, but often are created, well, they always are created by various forms of state violence in the form of policing, borders, internal policing, external policing, military, globalized military. Of universal reason, this sort of idea of a science or something like that as the most advanced knowledge system ever created, offering sort of certainty, predictability, offering solutions to all the problems of climate change, but at the expense of all other knowledge systems which have existed in the world, many of which were incredibly advanced and sophisticated. Hierarchies are very rife in our modern societies, lots of hierarchies, socioeconomic is one of those, other types of gender hierarchies, and so forth, which create very much sense of worthiness and unworthiness, deservedness and lack of deservedness, conditional dignity amongst many people in the world. Extractive human centrism, so the infinite growth paradigm, which we have, and obvious results of that are destruction of the biosphere. And this idea of separability, that we are somehow independent individual beings and we have sort of unrestricted autonomy, or we should have some sort of basic unquestionable rights that are individualized, which means we don't understand our interdependence with all of life very well. We commodify life. We assume a lot of deadness to a planet that's intrinsically alive, among other things. Okay, here are some words I put on a slide, just a bit of brainstorming, that I think epitomize colonization. I don't think I'm going to read those out, but just sort of with care for your own balance, take those in. And while you're doing so, I have a question from Ratna Devi about what does colonial mean? Well, this is what colonial means. It's the culture that epitomizes these ideas and the ones in the slide before. Certainty, growth, separatism, human exceptionalism, hierarchies, judgment, condemnation. This is what I'm taking colonialism or modernity to mean, modern societies that have particularly become evident in the last few centuries. What are the values that underpin them? And these are some of them on this slide and the table before. Ownership, yep, thank you, Dida. It is definitely an internal experience as well as an external process, absolutely. Yeah, colonialism is we swim in the stuff, but also it is part of us, and we are constituted in these colonial contexts, so we become colonial ourselves. What would be not colonial in the current world? Well, I'm glad you asked. Thank you, Helena. Let's get to that. So, decolonial perspectives. What is not colonial can be considered to be decolonial, obviously just adding D on the word, but indigenized as well is another way to think of it. Here's some decolonial perspectives. Nothing is complete, perfect, or enduring, but all is alive, sentient, profoundly relational, and deeply sacred. This is very much a decolonial perspective. We are immersed in unsensed worlds, so not a singular, rational, objective, physical world, but unsensed worlds, which we can strive to sense, to inhabit, to commingle with, and to grow with. We are invited to outgrow the often unquestioned need to obey, conform, judge, and repress, very colonial things to do, which stunts our ability to express, create, connect, and play with ourselves and with each other, with our world, with our worlds that we inhabit, that we dwell within. We are called to conscious, embodied, loving, reverent co-liberation with each other and the living cosmos. So these are decolonial perspectives. Of course, these exist in the world. They are repressed. Yeah, the colonialism has attempted to eradicate these views, but they're very much alive and well in pockets of the world. I want to go there too, Helena. Yes. The pockets are small. They're hard to find. Sounds quite spiritual. It's very spiritual, yes. But spiritual in a way that is connected with the material world. So it's not spiritual in a transcendent way. It's spiritual as in, that's what I mean, everything is deeply sacred. I mean, the entire material world, not some sort of other realm that we need to reach, but the realm we're already in. Embodied, grounded, yes, spirituality. Exactly. Gentleness is truly a form of decolonial resistance. Yes, absolutely right. Thank you for that. Extremely important. So, next slide. Decolonial futures. So this is not the perspectives. This is what maybe we could aim for in a currently colonial world. How would we become decolonial in this world? Well, here's some of the ways we could do it. We could relinquish debt, property, private property, institutions and nation states in order to overcome radical alienation from ourselves, from other living beings, our work, as in the passionate activity we engage with to create things in the world, and so-called nature. We could unlearn reductionism, truth as a singular thing, rightness as opposed to wrongness, power over others, other life, ambition, success, perfection, certainty, control, coherence, mastery, the concept of linear progress, concept of virtue, of validation, of heroism, of fame, of merit, of entitlement, of duty and sacrifice. We could unlearn those things, which mostly in their current manifestation prop up colonialism. We could explore ways of becoming, relating and perceiving that create a life beyond exceptionalism, human exceptionalism, exploitation, extraction, consumption, growth and human hubris. You know, these are just basically what is colonial and what can we do to kind of journey in a different way that isn't colonial. Some of that is fairly obvious, not all of it. So yes, healing. I'm very into healing. Thank you, Eva, for that. Healing from colonialism, very much so. I think I have a slide on healing. So we've got, yes, we need to transcend the very definition of the human. We need to transform what the human is, to metamorphosize beyond what the human is. So other parts of decolonial futures would be societies that value self-realization, freedom, interdependence, care, love, connection, celebration, beauty, grief. Not all good stuff in a way, but stuff that is just denied in colonial modernity. Grief is very much marginalized. It's an extremely important part of life. Cooperation, and cooperation in an egalitarian way. So not so much the hierarchies, not so much the institutionalized exploitative hierarchies, the hoarding of resources by the few of the work of the many. That's a very strong part of colonial modern societies as well. Is anyone ready to relinquish nation states? I certainly am. Yeah. A few other people seem into it too. Nation states are almost everywhere at the moment. Not every single patch of the earth, but pretty much. And they're not cultures at all. No, it's not to say that we need to get rid of cultures, but nation states. So some sort of artificial didactic sort of dialectic here that's a little bit, artificial, as I said, but give you a sense. So decolonial perspective would be about relative autonomy within embodied, constitutive, interdependent communal relationships. So I have a slide coming up about this, but basically relationships are really important. They're embodied, they constitute us, the relationships that create us essentially interdependently. But we also have some autonomy as well within those networks of relationships. Colonial perspectives are about growth, they're about order, they're about control, and they're about exploitation. And they're really within individualism as a paradigm, individualistic, hierarchical, oppressive pyramid schemes, essentially, Ponzi schemes, but we can call those a certain type of relationship too. I mean, colonialism also has relationships, obviously. Humans always have relationships. Who would consciously choose the second? Good question from Helena. Probably nobody, yeah. There's a lot of unconsciousness that goes on in modernity, a lot of amnesia, a lot of anesthesia, and this is how it operates. Yeah, not from some sort of deep connected consciousness, but a denial and a willful ignorance of truth. And through trauma, yes. And here are the sort of words that would characterize decolonial society. So the word constitutive just means how are we created? How are we constituted? How do we come to be? And we're constituted through relationships, or relationality would be how I would understand that. And I have a slide about relationships coming up in a sec that might explain that a bit more perhaps. So these are some of the things that you'd see more of in decolonial societies. Quite different from the other words that we had before. Subscendence is the opposite of transcendence. So transcendence is this idea that, it's a very colonial idea that there's something more important beyond the actual vast beauty of the material embodied world that we live in. Some sort of, heaven or something. That's transcendence. It's common in many spiritual traditions. I consider it to be a colonial idea. The opposite of transcendence is subsentence. So to descend or to fall apart into, to dwell within the depths of the realities that we have, the many worlds, the unsensed worlds of the physical present. It's about making the physical material world spiritual. Well, not even making, but recognizing, feeling that spiritual sacredness. The idea that everything is sacred means you don't need to transcend anything. You just need to feel into, to attune, to be actively receptive to the incredible sacredness of everything. So that's subscendence, the opposite of transcendence. Okay, decolonizing ourselves. Now that we've done a little bit of background. What's that about? How do we do that? Right, first of all, a little discussion about identity. So we're running out of time here, so I'm not going to go into too much, but I just want to say identity is a very modern concept, probably quite colonial. It's preoccupation over the last few centuries. We have a lot to say about identity politics these days. You can read more about this elsewhere, but I just wanted to make this point that the sense of self that we have in modernity constitutes identity as a paradigm through which we see ourselves, as a lens through which we experience ourselves. But in other cultures, ancient cultures and existing contemporary cultures, people had a different sense of self that didn't lend itself to identity. So I'm saying identity can be about very individualized, atomized, result of individualized, atomized, anonymous, fluid, contradictory, fragmented, self-fashioned, metropolitan living. A lot of identity as a concept arose out of modern, dense living conditions. And the prism of individualism is very much tied to identity. It's a little bit complex to explain in the no time that we have left, but be wary of identity and really feel into other ways of experiencing self would be my suggestion. So who am I? So we're talking about decolonising selves. So I want to talk about the self part of the decolonising selves. We are not identities. Perhaps we are something else. I am because we are, famous Ubuntu translation of what Ubuntu means, the African philosophy, rather than I think, therefore I am, which is the very famous Descartesian view of self. These are radically different things, and they make a big difference to how we experience ourselves. Perhaps Ubuntu is the decolonial answer to the Descartesian or the Cartesian divide. I think the question, who am I, is itself quite problematic. It sort of invites a sense of closure, of certainty, of definitiveness, of thingification, of creating a thing out of relational flows, and stuckness, which are quite modern and colonial in nature, in my view. I think it's the wrong question to ask. But we need to start there in many ways. It's perhaps wiser to attend to our lived experiences, our connections, our relationships, our feelings, our senses, our desires, intuitions, entanglements, as open-ended emergences rather than who am I as a question with some sort of possible answer at all. Yes, relational. So just back to this question about subsendence without hierarchy. Well, I guess, yeah, Dita's answer is what I would go with, is that, I mean, the opposite of oppressive, frozen, ossified hierarchies is self-organizing emergences. So the way that life organizes itself on planet Earth is an emergent, chaotic, complex, self-organizing system, which is very, very different to the sort of pyramids of hierarchies that we have in our societies. So this leads us to the question, do we even have selves that can be decolonized? Or perhaps the whole point of this, the whole framing as a self is the problem, is a colonial problem in itself. So there's lots of evidence of embodied cognition. So humans as very much influenced by our environments. Our thinking, our decision-making is influenced by the temperature of rooms, how comfortable the chairs are, whether we're hungry, whether our phones are present in the room with us, the time of day, the month, the season, and so forth. We have all these effects, the placebo, the nocebo, the Pygmalion, the Golem effect, which are basically expectational effects. Expectations of what happens creates what happens in many cases. There's now evidence that, you know, transplanting gut bacteria from one person to the next can take their mental health status with that gut bacteria. So psychiatric conditions can travel from one person to the next within gut bacteria. There's brain scans predicting free decisions or free choice ahead of the choice being made by the humans themselves. And all this really tells us that we don't have sort of a pre-existing independent self or a pre-existing independent thought that can be biased by all these things, that can be biased by temperature or by the distraction of our mobile phone being in our same room with us. There's nothing to bias. There's no core. We actually think and feel and perceive and relate with, by, and via our environments. We are part of our environments. So in other words, we're not separate, framed, distinct entities. We're actually porous, distributed, diffuse, diffracted, ongoing events. There is no self that exists independently of anything else. Instead, we are sort of a nexus point of relational flows. So basically what I'm saying is relationships are, if anything is primary in the universe or the living cosmos, it's relationships or relations. Things are kind of a kind of illusion of a sort of nexus point of relational flows that looks like something. It's a bit like, an example I like to use is a string, a piece of string. If you tie a knot in a piece of string, the knot in the string looks like it's sort of separate from the string. You know, it's a thing on the string. It's like you could almost take out the knot from the string and it would be a separate thing, but obviously you can't do that. That's the same with us. We are knots on many, many strings that are intertwined and entangled with each other. We appear to be things, but we're not. We're simply knots on string. Okay, any questions? Actually, I'm going to put you in. Oh, wait a minute. Oops. We're going to have some small group discussions of these questions to end. So perhaps, yeah, let's just work with these questions and then we can come back and have a general discussion about them. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, everybody. I managed to visit very briefly all the rooms. There's quite a few of us here on the virtual meeting gathering today. And I just wanted to say that listening to all the wisdom being shared in your small groups made my heart swell with joy. It was beautiful. And I'm not going to attempt to capture in words all of that. I can't even remember all the magical things I heard discussed. I just wanted to spend the last 4 minutes of the allotted time just open to anyone who wants to share how they're feeling, really, particularly how they're feeling. Any yeah, anything like that.
I'd like to share a song that says how I'm feeling.
Please do.
Living in the time of the great turning away from greed and war. We are living in the time of the great turning back to natural law. Going with nature heals our spirit. Going against her harms us all. Going with nature heals our spirit. Going against her harms us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Songs, rituals, ceremonies, myths, dance and art, carving, weaving. This is what we need more of in life. Yes. We have a reflection form on the session that's been shared in the chat. Some expressions of gratitude. Thank you. I'm very grateful for all of you for being part of this gathering. I've just posted my email to the chat. If anyone feels called to contact me personally, I welcome that very much. May you all grow in decolonial wisdom, in deep relating with each other. None of us are alone. We're not alone. This is I feel the great turning is upon us, and many people are beginning to dwell in decolonial ways of being, knowing, and doing. And thank you for being part of that collective arising and surging of the world.